Self, this is the last time. This is the very last time I stand out here and let them do this to me. If this story already has your heart, stay with me until the very end. Subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far Martha's story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The Summer Harvest Fair came to Red Creek every July, like a promise the town made to itself that for 3 days at least, everything would feel like abundance. The main street filled up with vendor tables and hand-painted signs with the smell of roasting corn and fresh-cut lumber, with children running between legs and old men trading stories beside water troughs. Farmers brought their best produce. Seamstresses displayed their finest work. Bakers set out their showpieces on white cloths pressed smooth with careful irons. Martha Dawson had been awake since 3 in the morning. She had baked 6 dozen cinnamon rolls, 4 deep-dish apple pies, 2 peach cobblers, 3 dozen honey biscuits, and a full tray of sugar cookies pressed into star shapes, because she had read somewhere that children were drawn to stars, and she thought maybe if the children stopped, the mothers might follow. She had loaded everything into her wagon herself, hitching the old mule named Biscuit in the gray half-light before sunrise, driving the 2 miles into town while the road was still cool enough to feel it through her boots. She had set up her table with a clean blue cloth. She had arranged everything with the kind of care most people reserve for things that matter to them, because this mattered to her. This mattered more than almost anything left in her life. By 9 in the morning, she had sold 4 biscuits to a traveling salesman who hadn't bothered to look at her face. By 11, she had sold 1 cookie to a small boy who pressed his penny into her hand with both of his and said, "Thank you, ma'am," the way children do when they've been raised right. She had smiled at him and meant it completely. By noon, she had sold nothing else. 3 years. 3 years she had been doing this. 3 years since Thomas Dawson had gone out to check the fence line on a cold October morning, and hadn't come home. 3 years since the fever had taken him in less than a week, since she had stood at his graveside in the rain, with her hands clasped and her jaw set, and told herself she would survive this. She had survived it. She had kept the small house on the edge of town. She had kept baking, because baking was the only language she still trusted, the only thing that said what she meant without any of the words coming out wrong. She had set up her wagon at the Saturday market and at the fair every summer, and she had stood behind her table, and she had tried. The town of Red Creek had not made it easy. Lord, does she think anybody's buying from her? She heard that. She always heard it. The voices of women who stood together in clusters near the quilting booth, close enough that they knew she could hear, and far enough that they could pretend they didn't mean for her to. She heard the particular tone of cruelty that women sometimes use on other women. Not loud, not aggressive, just precise and surgical and designed to land exactly where it would do the most damage. I heard she's been out here every Saturday for 3 years and never sells more than $1 worth. Well, what do you expect? She doesn't exactly make you want to stop. Martha kept her eyes on the table. She moved a cinnamon roll a half-inch to the left and then moved it back. It was Vernon Hale who made it worse. Vernon Hale owned the largest restaurant in Red Creek, a 2-story establishment called the Grand Plate that sat on the corner of Main and Lander Street with freshly painted shutters and a menu printed on real paper. Vernon was the kind of man who wore his prosperity like a coat. He never took off, who smiled at everyone in a way that managed to communicate simultaneously that he liked them and that he considered himself better than them. He was 45 years old, broad in the chest, with a thick brown mustache and small eyes the color of old creek water. He had never once been hungry a day in his life, and he had the easy cruelty of men who don't know what it costs to lose something. He came to her table at noon with 2 men behind him, business associates from the look of their city boots, and he stopped in front of her display with his thumbs hooked in his vest pockets, and he looked at her food, and then he looked at her, and then he looked back at his companions with an expression that said everything without saying anything at all. "Martha Dawson," he said, like her name was a small joke he'd just remembered. "Still at it. Good afternoon, Mr. Hale." She kept her voice level. She had years of practice keeping her voice level. "Fine spread," he said. He didn't mean it. They both knew he didn't mean it. "Tell you what, though. He picked up one of her cinnamon rolls and turned it over in his hand like he was examining something he'd found in the dirt. A man wants to enjoy his meal, doesn't he? Wants to feel... He paused, and his lips curved just slightly. Appetized. One of the men behind him made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Put it down, Vernon." The words were out of Martha's mouth before she could measure them, flat and direct, and without apology. Something shifted in Vernon Hale's expression. The easy amusement went cold for just a moment, just a flash of it, and then the smile came back wider than before. He set the roll down, but he set it down wrong on its side, smudging the glaze she'd brushed on at 5 in the morning. He reached into his coat and dropped a coin on the table. Not for the roll, for nothing, just to make the point. "You keep at it," he said. "A woman's got to do something with her time." He walked away. His companions followed, and she heard his voice carry back to her through the fair noise, not quietly, not by accident. "Wouldn't eat there if I was paid double. You ever seen the woman, Lord Almighty?" Followed by real laughter this time, open and satisfied. Martha stood still. She put both hands flat on the table. She breathed. Around her, the fair went on, children and music, and the smell of roasting corn, and the ordinary beautiful noise of people living their lives, and she stood inside it like a stone in a river, letting everything flow around her, letting none of it touch her, because if she let any of it touch her right now, she was going to break in a way she might not come back from. An older woman named Ruth Beckett, who sold quilts 2 tables down, caught Martha's eye and gave her a look of such helpless sympathy that it was almost worse than the cruelty. Ruth's eyes said, "I'm sorry. I saw that. I wish I'd said something." But Ruth hadn't said anything. Nobody ever did. That was the thing about Red Creek. It wasn't that the people were all bad. Most of them weren't bad at all. But they had decided somewhere along the way towns sometimes do that. Martha Dawson was a certain kind of person. The kind you pass by, the kind whose troubles aren't urgent enough to involve yourself in, the kind who exists at the edges of things without quite belonging to them. They had decided this the way you decide. The weather is cold without discussion, without cruelty of intent, simply as a fact of the landscape. And once a town has decided a thing like that about a person, it takes something extraordinary to change it. She began to pack her things. Not slowly, not theatrically, just steadily, the way she did everything with a quiet efficiency that didn't ask anyone to notice. She lifted the blue cloth. She stacked the unsold pies back into their carriers. She wrapped the remaining cinnamon rolls in wax paper and told herself she would take them to the Beckett children on her way home, because they were good children and they deserved something sweet. And this way, the morning would not have been entirely wasted. She was reaching for the last tray when she heard boots on the packed dirt. Slow, unhurried boots, the kind that belong to a man who isn't in a hurry, because he has decided where he's going, and there's no need to rush about it. "How much for one of those rolls?" She looked up. How was tall? Genuinely tall. Not the kind of tall that a hat adds a few inches to, but the foundational kind that starts somewhere in the chest and just keeps going. Dark hair pushed back from a weathered face. Jaw set with a kind of permanent, quiet resolve, dark eyes that were looking at her display with what appeared to be genuine attention. He wore a plain work shirt, the sleeves rolled twice above the wrist, and a dark vest over that, and the hands he had rested on the edge of her table were the hands of a man who worked with them daily. She hadn't seen him before. Red Creek was small enough that she would have noticed. "2 cents, she said. He reached into his shirt pocket, came out with a nickel, and set it down. "I'll take 2. She wrapped them without asking his name. He took the packet, peeled back the paper on the first one, and bit into it right there in front of her. She watched without meaning to watch, the way you watch someone open a letter you sent a long time ago with a particular quality of anxious attention. He chewed. He was quiet for a moment. "Ma'am," he said. "Yes. This is the best thing I have eaten in Red Creek in 4 years. She blinked. 4 years is a long time. I have been waiting 4 years for something to taste like this. He looked at the second roll in his hand and then back at her. What else did you make? Something happened in her chest that she hadn't expected. Not warmth exactly, or not just warmth, something more specific than that. The sensation of being seen by someone who was actually looking. Apple pie, she said, peach cobbler, honey biscuits. I'll take a pie. I was packing them. Unpack one. He said it simply without any edge to it, and then he added, please, like the word had always been there and he'd just located it. She unpacked a pie. He paid for it with exact change and asked her what time she opened on Saturdays. She told him 7. He nodded like that was reasonable information. He was about to leave when he stopped and turned back and said, I haven't introduced myself. Caleb Walker. I run Walker Ridge about 12 miles north of town. Martha Dawson. Mrs. Dawson. He touched the brim of his hat, not a casual gesture, a deliberate one. I'll see you Saturday. He walked away into the fair. She watched him go. Behind her, Ruth Beckett had drifted close enough to observe and was now standing with her hands folded and a complicated expression on her face. Martha didn't look at her. She looked at the 5-cent piece still sitting on the edge of her table, and at the space where Caleb Walker had been standing, and at the half-eaten cinnamon roll wrapper he'd tucked carefully under the edge of her display so it didn't blow away. That evening she drove home through the long Wyoming sunset, and she didn't cry. She hadn't cried in 3 years, and she didn't intend to start tonight. But somewhere in the quiet of the drive with Biscuit, plodding steadily along the ruts of the road, and the sky going orange and then purple above the mountains, she allowed herself one small private thing. She let herself think about tomorrow. Not about Vernon Hale. Not about the women at the quilting table. Not about the years of Saturdays with their empty tables and their careful arrangements and their quiet grinding humiliation. She thought about the man with the dark eyes and the steady hands who had eaten a cinnamon roll like it meant something. She thought, so maybe I don't stop baking just yet. The Saturday market was smaller than the fair. Half the vendors, a quarter of the traffic. Martha set up at 6:45 with her usual spread: 4 pies, a cobbler, biscuits, cinnamon rolls, 2 loaves of fresh bread, because she'd had extra dough and nowhere better to put it. At 7:05, Caleb Walker appeared. He bought 3 rolls and both loaves of bread without negotiating the price. He ate 1 roll standing at the end of her table while the market woke up around them, and then he said in the conversational tone of a man broaching a subject he has already decided about, I need to talk to you about something. All right, my ranch cook quit 6 weeks ago, packed up on a Tuesday, and didn't say a word until he was already on the stage. I've been feeding 12 men with whatever I can put together, and I'll tell you frankly, Mrs. Dawson, it's been a poor situation. She looked at him. You're offering me a job. I am. Based on 2 cinnamon rolls and a pie. Based on 20 years of knowing what good food tastes like. He met her eyes. Room and board included. A proper wage better than whatever you're clearing here on Saturdays, I'd wager. He paused. I'm not interested in charity, and I don't imagine you are either. I need a cook. You're the best one I've tasted in this county. That's the sum of it. The market moved around them. A woman she recognized from church walked by and looked once at Caleb Walker and once at Martha, and then deliberately looked away, the particular way of someone who is filing something away for later discussion. Martha said, How many men? 12 regular hands. More during drive season. Could be 16, 18. Breakfast and supper or 3 meals. 3 when we're at the ranch. 2 during drives. I'd need access to the supply arrangements. The cooks order what you've been buying where from. You'd have full authority over the kitchen. She was quiet for a moment. She looked at her table, the careful arrangement, the wax paper, the blue cloth that she washed every Friday night and spread fresh every Saturday morning for 3 years of Saturdays that had added up to almost nothing. When would you need an answer? She asked. Now would suit me, he said, but I'll give you until Thursday if you need to think it over. Now suits me too, she said. I'll start Monday. Something moved in his expression. Not quite a smile, not exactly, but something in the vicinity of something quiet and contained. Monday, he said. He touched his hat. Thank you, Mrs. Dawson. Don't thank me yet. You haven't tasted my supper. No, he said. But I intend to. He collected his bread and his rolls and walked back through the market toward wherever he'd hitched his horse, and Martha stood behind her table and felt for the first time in 3 years like the ground beneath her feet was something she could trust. She didn't know yet what was coming. She didn't know about Vernon Hale's particular variety of persistence, or about the way jealousy curdles in a man who measures his worth by other people's failure. She didn't know that Walker Ridge was going to become the kind of place people talked about across 4 counties. She didn't know that 12 suspicious ranch hands were about to have their understanding of supper fundamentally revised. She knew only that she had a real job with a real wage, doing the only thing she had ever been any good at. She knew that someone had stopped at her table and looked at her food and tasted it and said, "This is worth paying for. This is worth coming back for." For Martha Dawson, after 3 years of invisible Saturdays and empty tables, and the particular loneliness of being a woman in a small town who doesn't fit the shape the town has decided she ought to be, that was not a small thing. That was everything. Monday morning came the way serious things tend to come, without ceremony, without warning. Just suddenly there at the edge of your life, asking you to step forward. Martha had packed 1 bag. She had been practical about it. A change of clothes, her personal knives wrapped in a cloth roll, her mother's recipe book with the cracked spine and the pages that smelled like 20 years of kitchens. She had locked the house, told her neighbor Mrs. Pierce she'd be at Walker Ridge, and climbed up onto the wagon seat before the sun was fully over the ridge. Biscuit knew the road north well enough. She let him set the pace. 12 miles felt longer when you were heading toward something unfamiliar. She smelled Walker Ridge before she saw the main house, wood smoke and cut hay, and the particular clean animal smell of a working ranch in summer. The kind of smell that means people live here and mean it. The yard was already active when she pulled in. 2 hands were mending fence posts near the gate. Another was crossing from the bunkhouse toward the barn with a bridle slung over his shoulder. They all stopped when her wagon came through. She didn't wait for anyone to help her down. She climbed down herself, tied Biscuit to the post, and lifted her bag from the seat. A young hand, couldn't have been more than 19, with a sunburned nose, and the kind of expression that doesn't know yet how to be anything other than completely transparent, stepped forward and said, "You the new cook?" "I am." He looked at her, the way a person looks at something that doesn't match their expectation. Not mean about it. Just honest, in that unguarded way of people who haven't yet learned to hide their first reactions. "Huh," he said. "Huh," she agreed pleasantly, and walked past him toward the kitchen door. The kitchen was a solid room off the back of the main house, bigger than her whole house in town, with a cast iron range the size of a small wagon, a long work table down the center, and shelves along 3 walls that held what 6 weeks of bachelor cooking had done to an orderly pantry. She stood in the doorway for a moment, taking inventory. Flour in the wrong bins. Sugar mixed in with the salt. She could tell by the way the jar sat. The weight distribution was wrong. A skillet on the back of the range with something dried and blackened in it that had been there long enough to qualify as permanent. She set her bag down. She put on her apron. She found a clean rag and started with the skillet. Caleb Walker appeared in the kitchen doorway 20 minutes later. She had already reorganized the lower shelves established where she wanted the bread supplies and located a cast-iron Dutch oven that someone had shoved behind a bag of cornmeal like it had done something wrong. "Mrs. Dawson," he said, "you found the place." "I did." She didn't stop moving. "Your pantry's a disaster." "Yes, ma'am." "Whoever was buying supplies was buying blind. You've got 3 pounds of nutmeg and no cinnamon." "I wouldn't know. I stopped going in here after the first week." She turned and looked at him. "What were you feeding them?" Something passed over his face that might have been genuine shame. "Beans," he said. "Mostly beans." "For 6 weeks." "Yes, ma'am." She turned back to the shelves. "I'll need a supply run by Wednesday. I'll make a list." She paused. "What time do your men sit down in the morning?" 6. They're out by 4:30. "I'll have breakfast at 5:45. She pulled a canister from the shelf, pried the lid, smelled it. "This coffee is 2 months old." "That's probably accurate." "I'll need fresh ground." "You'll have it." He stayed in the doorway another moment. "My men are—" He paused like he was choosing the word carefully. "Accustomed to a certain level of expectation." "You mean they expect to be disappointed?" He almost smiled. "I mean they may not be particularly welcoming at first." "Mr. Walker," she said, not turning around. I stood behind an empty table at the Red Creek Market for 3 years. 12 suspicious cowboys is going to feel like a holiday. I was quiet. Then, fair enough. He touched the doorframe. Dinner's at noon. I'll get out of your way. He left. She heard his boots go down the hall and out the front door, and then the yard sounds came back. Voices, movement, the ordinary percussion of a working day. She stood in the kitchen alone and felt the size of the room around her, the solidity of the range, the weight of the Dutch oven in her hands. Outside the window, she wasn't looking at it. She was working, but she could feel the light of it. The Wyoming morning was going gold and enormous, the way Wyoming mornings do, like the sky decided to be generous today. She had biscuits in the oven by 5:15. She had gravy started by 5:30. She had eggs on at 5:40, and the coffee made fresh, and the table set with actual plates. She'd found them stacked in a cabinet. Someone had pushed shut with what appeared to be final intent, when the hands came in at 5:47, still pulling on jackets, still rough with sleep, filing in with the automatic wariness of men who have been disappointed in kitchens before. They stopped. 12 men in various states of morning disarray, and every single one of them stopped at the doorway of the dining room and stood there in silence for a moment that stretched long enough to become something. It was the smell. She knew it was the smell. She had made enough biscuits in her life to know what a good batch did to a room, the butter and the flour and the heat, the particular quality of something made carefully and meant to nourish. It hit them the way it always hit people who were genuinely hungry, in a way that went beyond just not eating. The kind of hungry that comes from being fed badly for too long. The boy with the sunburned nose, she'd learned his name was Pete, was the first to sit down. He did it like he wasn't sure he was allowed to. She set the biscuits on the table, and the gravy beside them, and the eggs in the center, and she poured coffee into the tin cups without asking who wanted it, because in her experience, everyone always wanted it, and she stepped back. Nobody spoke for almost 2 full minutes. Then a man at the far end of the table, older, gray-haired, the kind of weathered that means decades, not years, whose name she would later learn was Dutch Kavanaugh, the foreman who had been running ranches since before some of these boys were born, looked up from his plate and said with a deliberateness that told her he didn't say things carelessly, "Ma'am, this is a biscuit." "It is," she said. "I haven't had a biscuit like this since my mother was alive." She didn't say anything to that. Some things deserve to land and sit without being moved. Pete had already taken 3. A hand named Rodrigo, who she'd noticed hadn't made eye contact with her at all when she came in, was quietly, methodically working through everything on the table with the focused attention of a man who has decided to take this seriously. Another hand, a big, quiet Swede named Lars, who barely spoke under any circumstances, had his eyes closed while he chewed. Not performing, just genuinely elsewhere for a moment, in some better place that the food had unlocked. She went back to the kitchen. She had bread dough that needed the second fold. By noon, every plate at dinner was empty before she'd finished bringing everything to the table. By supper, 3 of the hands had found reasons to come through the kitchen on their way to somewhere else, not asking for anything, just passing through, just existing near the room where the food came from, in the way that people are drawn to warmth without always meaning to be. Dutch Kavanaugh found her at the sink after supper washing down the work table. He stood in the doorway the same way Caleb had that morning. These were men who understood thresholds, who didn't come into a woman's kitchen without announcement. "Mrs. Dawson," he said. "Mr. Kavanaugh." "The men wanted me to—" He stopped, started again. "They asked me to say something to you." She looked at him. He was a man not built for this kind of conversation. She could see that clearly he was built for fence lines and cattle counts and the clean, direct language of physical work. But he was standing here anyway, because someone had to, and he was the foreman, and that meant the uncomfortable things fell to him. "They said thank you," he said simply. "The meal, it meant something." She turned back to the work table. "Tell them they're welcome. And Lars, the big Swede." He paused. "He doesn't talk much, but he came to me after supper, and he said to make sure you knew that the peach cobbler was the best thing he'd eaten in 20 years. He was very specific about the 20 years. She pressed her lips together for a moment. "Noted," she said. Dutch nodded, touched his hat to a woman who had her back to him, which told her something about who he was, and left. That night, she sat on the back step of the kitchen in the dark and looked at the Wyoming sky going black above the mountains and felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Not happiness. Exactly, happiness was too simple a word for what it was. It was more like the return of something she thought she'd permanently lost. The sense of being in the right place, doing the right thing for people who could actually feel it. She let herself have it for exactly 10 minutes. Then she went inside and started planning breakfast. The news traveled the way. News travels in ranch country, not through newspapers or deliberate announcement, but through the casual network of men who cross paths at water troughs and supply depots and along fence lines that run between properties. By the end of the first week, Caleb Walker had 2 separate neighbors find reasons to ride by the ranch around mealtimes. Both of them were invited in. Both of them stayed. By the end of the second week, a cattle buyer named Henderson, who had been stopping in Red Creek on his supply route for 11 years, began routing 12 miles out of his way specifically to sit at the Walker Ridge table. He told Martha with a kind of reverence that she didn't quite know what to do with that. Her pot roast had made him rethink his whole opinion of Wyoming. "I always figured Wyoming was a place you passed through," he said, sopping up gravy with a piece of her bread. "Now I'm thinking maybe it's a destination." Caleb heard that from the other end of the table and said nothing, but she caught the slight change in his posture, the quiet satisfaction of a man watching something he believed in being proved right. The hands had come around completely by the end of the first week. Pete had become openly, unguardedly devoted. He volunteered to carry supplies from the wagon. He reported to the kitchen with firewood before she'd asked. He had apparently told his younger brother in a letter that the cook at Walker Ridge made biscuits that changed your life because the brother had shown up one afternoon asking if he could eat supper for money. She had fed him for free and told him to come back Sundays. Dutch Cavanaugh watched all of this with the careful attention of someone who was revising an opinion he'd held for a long time. He had not been unkind to her when she arrived, but he had been neutral in that specifically weighted way. That means, I'll believe it when I see it. By the end of the second week, the neutrality had softened into something closer to respect. He started consulting her about supply runs. He asked her opinion about the best time to schedule meals during the upcoming drive. He treated her, in other words, like someone whose judgment was worth having. One evening about 3 weeks in, Caleb came to the kitchen after the hands had gone to the bunkhouse and stood in the doorway in a way that was different from his usual appearances. Not business, something else. "You should know," he said, "that Henderson is telling people about this place. Ranchers I've done business with for years have been asking me about the kitchen." "I know," she said. "I've been feeding 3 extra people a day for the past week." "You don't mind," she considered it. "I mind when I run short on supplies. I don't mind the feeding." He was quiet for a moment, leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed. "Some of the ranchers' wives have been asking about you." She kept her hands moving in the dough she was working. "What are they asking?" "Whether you'd consider doing Sunday dinners, a regular thing, families." She stopped. She set the dough down. She turned to look at him. "You're serious?" "I am, Caleb." She said his name for the first time without the mister, and neither of them acknowledged it, but it was there between them for a moment, something small and deliberate. "I know what it is," he said. "It's more work. It's also more income." He paused. "And it's what you're capable of. Anyone with a tongue and good sense can see that." She looked at her hands. Flour on her palms, the familiar weight of it, the way the dough had already told her this batch was going to be right. "Sunday dinners," she said. "If you're willing." She was quiet for 10 seconds. Maybe 15. Outside the window the night was dark and full of crickets, and somewhere in the pasture a horse moved through the grass with a sound like water. Inside the kitchen it was warm from the range and smelled like the bread that was cooling on the rack and the remains of the herb chicken she'd made for supper. "I'll need 2 more people in the kitchen," she said. "I can't do Sunday dinners alone." "Done." "And a bigger supply order." "Done. And a proper Sunday tablecloth. Not those oilcloth things, something decent." He almost smiled. The almost smile was becoming something she could read now, the slight shift in the set of his jaw. The particular quality of quiet that meant he was more pleased than he was showing. "Done," he said. "Then yes," she said. Sunday dinners. What she didn't know, what she had no way of knowing, standing in that kitchen with flour on her hands and the Wyoming night pressing soft and enormous against the windows, was that word had already reached Red Creek. Henderson had a loose tongue and a wide social circle, and he'd been talking in the saloon and at the feed store and at the dry goods counter, and the talk had reached among other ears, the particular ears of Vernon Hale, who was not a man who took the sound of other people's success without doing something about it. But that was still a few weeks away. Tonight there was just the kitchen warm and certain, and the dough under her hands, and the small, serious satisfaction of a decision made in the right direction. And somewhere in the back of her mind, very quietly, like a lamp being lit in a room that had been dark for a long time, the beginning of something she didn't have a name for yet, but that felt unmistakably like hope. The first Sunday dinner happened on a Tuesday in Martha's planning, and a Saturday in her kitchen, and a Sunday at noon, when 14 people sat down at the Walker Ridge table, and nobody left for 3 hours. She had hired 2 women from town. Clara Briggs, a widow in her 40s, whose husband had left her with 4 children and a debt she'd been quietly drowning in, and Nora Sells, who was 62 years old, and had been doing other people's washing for 12 years, because nobody thought to offer her anything better. Martha had gone to find them herself, specifically because she knew what it meant to be capable and overlooked, and she wasn't interested in building something that didn't account for that. Clara cried the first morning in the kitchen. Not from sadness, from the simple, overwhelming shock of being treated like a professional by someone who meant it. Martha handed her a clean apron and told her to stop, not unkindly, and put her to work on the pie crusts. Nora didn't cry. Nora rolled up her sleeves and looked at the range like it was an old argument she intended to win, and Martha recognized in her immediately a woman who had been waiting years for someone to give her the right room to work in. The Sunday dinners filled every seat within 3 weeks. Within 6 people were arriving early and waiting in the yard. Ranching families from 15 miles out. A circuit preacher who happened to stop and happened to stay and happened to mention it in 4 separate towns on his route. 2 sisters from Colorado who were visiting relatives in Red Creek and made the 12-mile ride specifically because Henderson had told their uncle it was worth the trip, and the uncle had relayed this with enough conviction that they'd believed him. Martha moved through all of it, the way she moved through everything, steadily, purposefully, without drama. She learned names. She remembered how people took their coffee. She noticed when someone looked like they needed a second helping and put it on their plate before they had to ask. She did these things not because she was performing generosity, but because it was simply how she understood the work. Feeding people was not just about the food. It was about the attention, the recognition that someone had come to your table, and that mattered. Caleb watched all of it. He wasn't a man who hovered or commented unnecessarily, but she was aware of him in the way you become aware of someone whose presence has started to feel like a fixed point. Reliable, constant, always roughly where you expected it to be. He managed the front of things. He greeted people when they arrived, made sure the yard arrangements worked, handled the money side with the clean efficiency of a man who had been running a business for 20 years. He never once suggested she was doing anything wrong. He never once made her feel like a hired hand, rather than a partner in something that was growing beyond both of their original expectations. She was grateful for that. She was more grateful than she knew how to say, so she didn't say it. She just kept cooking. It was Dutch Kavanaugh who first told her something was wrong. He came to the kitchen on a Wednesday morning 6 weeks into the Sunday dinners, with the look of a man carrying news he'd rather not carry. He waited until Clara and Nora had gone to collect eggs before he said anything. "There's talk in town," he said. She kept working. "There's always talk in town. Different kind of talk." He set his hat on the table, which meant he was staying, which meant it was serious. Hale's been in the Red Creek Gazette, not by name, but somebody put a piece in about unlicensed eating establishments operating outside city limits, using language about public health, unsanitary conditions. She stopped. She turned around. Unsanitary conditions. His words, near as I can tell. Her jaw tightened. "He's never set foot on this property." "No," Dutch said. But he doesn't need to. He needs people to wonder. He met her eyes. There's more. Jake Pruitt over at the feed store told me Hale's been talking to somebody at the county office. I don't know exactly what's being said, but Jake said Hale's been over there 3 times in 2 weeks. She stood very still. She knew what that meant. Not the details of it yet, not the specific mechanism, but she knew what 3 visits to a county official from a man like Vernon Hale pointed toward, and the knowledge sat in her stomach like cold iron. She'd seen this before, not to herself, but she'd seen it. The way men who feel their position threatened don't come at you directly. They find the paperwork. They find the ordinance. They find the obscure regulation from 18 years ago that nobody's enforced since, and they dust it off and they put it to use. How long do you think we have? She asked. Dutch picked up his hat. I'd say before Sunday. She nodded once. She turned back to her work table. Dutch left, and she stood there for a moment with her hands on the edge of the table, not moving, just letting the shape of what was coming settle into something she could work with. Then she picked up her knife and started on the carrots she'd been cutting, and didn't stop until the whole bunch was done. She told Caleb that evening. He heard everything she said without interrupting, sitting across the kitchen table from her with his arms folded and his expression doing that thing it did when he was thinking, very still, very present. The slight tension at the corners of his eyes, the only indication that anything was registering. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Dutch is probably right about the timeline, he said. I know. I can have someone in Red Creek by morning. Garrett Moss handles legal matters for the ranch. He's thorough. That's good, she paused. But I want to understand exactly what they're going to claim before we start answering it. If we go in wrong, we hand them the frame. He looked at her. You've thought about this. I've been thinking about it since the first Sunday dinner, she said, which was true. She'd known somewhere in the practical part of her mind that never fully quieted that success would bring this. Success always brought this for women like her in places like this. Hale's not going to come at the food. He knows he can't beat the food. He's going to come at the legality. Something about operating a commercial dining establishment without a county license or a health certification or both. Can we get those? Probably, but not by Sunday. Caleb was quiet again. Then we don't hold Sunday dinner. We hold it, she said immediately. We hold it, and we document everything, every person who comes, every meal served, every plate that goes back clean. We build the record they're going to need to dismiss this. You shut down, and you look guilty. You keep going, and you make them prove it. He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his expression was different. Not the almost smile, something more direct than that. Something that sat behind his eyes with a quality she didn't fully examine, because examining it felt like opening a door. She wasn't sure about the room behind. All right, he said. We hold it. Friday came and went without incident. Saturday morning, Martha was up at 3 working prep for the largest Sunday dinner, yet she'd had 22 confirmations, which meant she needed to account for 30, because people always brought someone they'd forgotten to mention. Clara and Nora arrived at 5. The 3 of them worked in the particular focused silence of women who understood each other by now, who had developed the kitchen shorthand of people who've shared enough hours in the same space to stop needing words for most of it. At 8:30 on Saturday morning, Pete came through the back door with a face like a thunderstorm. Miss Martha, he said, something happened to the supply shed. She was at the door before he finished the sentence. Someone had been in the shed overnight. The flour sacks, both of them 50 pounds each, had been cut open and contaminated. She could see it from the doorway without touching anything. Something dark mixed in something that didn't belong. The salt canisters were open. The sugar barrel had been tampered with. 3 jars of preserves she'd put up herself were shattered on the floor, the glass mixed into the spilled contents in a way that made everything around them unusable. She stood in the doorway and looked at it and did not move for a long time. Pete stood behind her. He didn't say anything because there was nothing useful to say. She heard him take a breath like he was about to try anyway, and she said quietly, "Go get Dutch." Dutch came. Dutch looked. Dutch's expression went very cold in the specific way of a man who has been around long enough to recognize deliberate harm when he sees it. "Somebody was here last night," he said. "Yes, The hands would have heard. Not if they came in from the creekside past the old cottonwood break. There's a quarter-mile of approach there where you can't see the shed from the bunkhouse. She had been on this property long enough to know its geography. This wasn't random. They knew what to ruin. Dutch looked at her. You're still doing Sunday dinner. I need to get to town and back before noon. I'll drive you. You've got work, Miss Martha. He said it with the full weight of a man who has revised his opinion of someone completely and permanently. I'll drive you. She was in Red Creek by 9:15, in the dry goods store by 9:20, and back at the ranch by 11, with everything she needed, because Dutch drove the way he did everything with the direct efficiency of someone who doesn't see the point in doing things slowly when they need to be done. She was back in the kitchen by 11:15. She had 20 minutes less than she needed, and she worked through the gap by moving faster, by asking Clara to handle 3 things simultaneously that Clara handled without complaint, by making the kind of real-time calculation adjustments that only come from years of cooking under pressure. Nora, who had been told what happened in the supply shed, said nothing about it, and worked with a focused ferocity that told Martha she understood perfectly what was at stake. 26 people sat down to Sunday dinner. Every plate was clean. The notice from the county came Monday morning, delivered by a deputy who looked uncomfortable about it and left quickly. Martha read it at the kitchen table with her coffee going cold beside her. Caleb read it over her shoulder without comment. Garrett Moss, the attorney, was at the ranch by early afternoon. He read the notice carefully. Twice. He set it down on the table, and he said, "This is Hale's signature all over it. The language is his lawyer's. I recognize the phrasing. They've found a county ordinance from 1871 about commercial food establishments operating within 10 miles of an incorporated township without a county health certification. It's been on the books for 17 years, and I am fairly confident it has never once been enforced." "But it's valid," Caleb said. "It's valid," Moss confirmed, "which means they can call a hearing, and they probably will." "When?" 2 weeks likely. Maybe less if Hale pushes. Moss laced his fingers together on the table. "The hearing officer will be Judge Calloway." The room went quiet. Martha looked at Caleb. Caleb's jaw had tightened almost imperceptibly. Dutch, who was standing by the door, had gone very still. She said, "Tell me about Calloway." Moss chose his words. "He is not a dishonest man exactly, but he is a man who values his relationships with the established business community. He and Hale have been—" He paused. "They have been friendly for a number of years." Friendly, Martha repeated. "Yes." She looked at the notice on the table. She thought about the flour sacks with the dark substance mixed in. She thought about 3 years of empty Saturdays. She thought about Clara Briggs, who cried on her first day because someone had treated her like a professional. She thought about Nora Sells, who had been doing other people's washing for 12 years. She thought about Lars the Swede, with his eyes closed over a biscuit somewhere better. For a moment, unlocked by someone who had taken the time to cook something that meant it, she picked up the notice. She folded it. She set it in her apron pocket. "Then we go to the hearing," she said. "And we make sure the truth is louder than Hale's friendship." Moss looked at her. Then he looked at Caleb. Something passed between the two men that she caught in her peripheral vision, a look that said, "This woman is not going to be the problem here." "All right," Moss said. He opened his case and took out a fresh sheet of paper. "Tell me everything. Every person who's eaten at this table. Every rancher, every traveler, every family. Every name you can remember. We're going to need witnesses." She pulled her chair in. She clasped her hands on the table. She began. She had no way of knowing yet that Vernon Hale had already made his second mistake. The first had been the supply shed, which Pete had seen from the bunkhouse window at 2 in the morning, when he'd gotten up for water, had seen a shadow moving toward the creekside, and had not fully understood what he was seeing until he'd looked at the shed in the morning. Pete had already told Dutch. Dutch had already told Caleb. And Caleb had already sent a rider to the county sheriff's office with a statement. Not with accusations, just with a documented account of what had been found and when and by whom. Evidence has a way of accumulating quietly when the people doing the accumulating understand that patience is a weapon. and Martha Dawson, who had stood behind an empty table for 3 years while the world told her she didn't matter, understood patience better than most people alive. Vernon Hale had spent 6 weeks watching her succeed. He had spent 2 weeks planning how to stop her. He had spent one night in a supply shed with a knife and a dark substance and the absolute confidence of a man who has never had to answer for anything. He was about to find out what it meant to be wrong on all 3 counts. Garrett Moss spent 9 days preparing. Martha spent those 9 days cooking and building a list. Not in her head on paper, in the careful handwriting she'd developed over years of recipe books and supply orders. Every name she could remember, every face she'd fed, every family who had sat at the Walker Ridge table and left full and satisfied. And this was the part that mattered had come back. She filled 2 pages, then a third. She gave the list to Moss on the 5th day, and he looked at it for a long time without speaking. "This is 47 people," he said. 51. I remembered 4 more this morning." He looked up at her. "How many will come to the hearing?" "All of them," she said. "If we ask right." Caleb had been riding since the first day Moss arrived, not dramatically, not with announcement, just the quiet, purposeful riding of a man who knows his territory and his neighbors. He went ranch to ranch, stop to stop, and he did not ask for sympathy. He told people the facts, what Martha had built, what Vernon Hale had done, what was at stake at the hearing. He told them about the supply shed. He told them about the county ordinance being wielded like a weapon against a woman who had fed half the territory. And then he asked plainly, man to man, whether they were willing to say so in a county hearing room. Not one person said no. Henderson the cattle buyer said yes before Caleb finished the sentence and added that if necessary, he would ride from Colorado, and that Hale had always been a small man, dressed up in a big coat, and he was glad somebody was finally making him take it off. Ruth Beckett from the market, who had watched the whole thing at the fair with helpless sympathy and done nothing, sent word through her husband that she would be at the hearing and that she had something to say. Her message was short, and it carried in it the particular weight of a woman who has been carrying guilt about her silence for too long and is ready to set it down. Even the circuit preacher, who was 3 towns away, sent a letter. It arrived on the 7th day, addressed to Garrett Moss in careful ministerial handwriting, and it said that Martha Dawson's table was the closest thing to a sacrament he had encountered in the Wyoming Territory, and he would testify to that effect under any oath required. Moss read the letter twice and said quietly, "Well." The hearing was set for a Thursday. The county office in Red Creek was a single room above the post office with 12 chairs and a raised desk at the front where Judge Calloway would sit. It was not designed for crowds. By the time Martha and Caleb arrived on Thursday morning, there were people waiting on the stairs and in the street outside because the room was already full. Martha saw it and stopped walking. She hadn't expected this. She had expected the people she'd asked. She hadn't accounted for the ones nobody had specifically invited, the ranch wives who'd heard and come on their own initiative, the hands from neighboring spreads who'd taken a day off work, Pete's younger brother who'd eaten one free Sunday supper and apparently decided that was sufficient basis for civic participation. Old Lars the Swede was there standing against the wall with his arms folded, taking up the space of approximately 1.5 normal men. He didn't look at her when she came in. He looked straight ahead. But he was there. Caleb put his hand briefly at the small of her back as they came through the door. Not possessively, not dramatically, just the light, certain touch of someone saying, "I'm here," and then his hand was gone, and they were walking to the front of the room. Vernon Hale was already seated on the right side with his attorney, a thin man named Colworth, who had the expression of someone who smells something unpleasant but is too polite to mention it. Hale looked the way men like him always look when they are certain they have already won, comfortable, slightly bored with the particular looseness of someone who has already counted the money. He glanced at Martha when she came in. He looked at the room behind her, and some of that looseness tightened slightly around the edges. Judge Calloway called the proceeding to order at 9 o'clock. He was a heavy man in his 60s with a gray beard and small reading glasses, and the kind of deliberate manner that could mean either absolute fairness or comfortable corruption, and for the first hour Martha couldn't tell which it was. Colworth presented the ordinance. He was smooth and precise about it, The 1871 statute, the 10-mile radius, the absence of county health certification, the nature of commercial dining operations. He cited 3 other cases, all of them minor, all of them settled years ago. He spoke for 22 minutes and said almost nothing. Martha hadn't anticipated, and she watched Calloway's face the whole time and read nothing in it. Then Moss stood up. He began with the history of the ordinance, specifically why it had been written in 1871, which was to protect township merchants from competition by traveling vendors, and why the situation at Walker Ridge bore precisely 0 resemblance to that original intent. He was measured and exact. He cited the statute's own language back against Callworth's interpretation in a way that made the interpretation look not wrong exactly, but thin, the way old fabric looks when you hold it up to light. Then he called his first witness. Henderson, the cattle buyer, took the stand and said in the blunt, direct way of a man who moves livestock across 3 states for a living that Walker Ridge provided the finest meal he had encountered in 20 years of working the Wyoming supply routes, that the operation was scrupulously clean, that he had eaten there 14 times and had never been ill, and that the county would be performing a significant disservice to its own traveling commerce by shutting it down. He said this last part, looking directly at Judge Calloway, not at Callworth, which Martha noted. Calloway said nothing. He made a small mark on the paper in front of him. The second witness was a rancher named Beaumont, 53 years old, who had brought his wife and 3 of his ranch hands to Sunday dinner for the past 4 weeks running. Beaumont was a man of few words and large silences, and everything he said landed with the weight of someone who doesn't speak unless he means it. He said that Martha Dawson ran a clean, professional, and uncommonly fine operation, that the women she employed had been given dignified work, that they did excellently, and that any county action against her would be— He paused here, selecting his word foolish. Callworth objected to the characterization. Calloway allowed it to stand. The third witness was Ruth Beckett. She was 60 years old, and she was nervous. Martha could see that from where she sat, the way Ruth held her hands together in her lap, the careful way she sat down, the slight tremor at the corners of her mouth before she composed herself. But she composed herself fully before she spoke, and when she spoke, her voice was clear. "I was at the summer harvest fair," she said. "I was 2 tables away when Mr. Hale approached Mrs. Dawson's booth." She paused. "I heard what he said to her. In front of customers. In front of people who could hear him clearly." She looked at the judge. It was designed to humiliate her and to drive customers away from her table. "I watched it happen, and I said nothing, and I have been ashamed of that for 2 months." Her voice didn't break, but it came close. "I'm saying something now." The room was very quiet. Calloway looked at Hale. Hale was looking at the table in front of him. His attorney was writing something on a paper that did not appear to require that much writing. Then Moss introduced the supply shed. He did it quietly, without theater. He simply presented Dutch Kavanaugh's sworn written statement, Pete's written account of what he'd seen from the bunkhouse at 2 in the morning, and the report from the county sheriff's deputy, who had inspected the shed and documented the contamination. He set the 3 documents on the judge's desk in a neat row and said, "Your Honor, I would like the record to reflect that on the night of Saturday, 2 weeks prior to this hearing, someone with specific knowledge of Walker Ridge's supply arrangements deliberately contaminated Mrs. Dawson's food stores in a manner designed to prevent Sunday service. I am not making a formal accusation in this proceeding. I am establishing a pattern of conduct relevant to the question of who is actually violating community standards here." Callworth was on his feet. "Objection. That is entirely speculative." "Is it?" Moss said, and he reached into his case and produced one more document. "Because the county sheriff received 3 days ago a signed statement from a man named Roy Fielding, who has been employed on occasion by Mr. Hale in various capacities, in which Mr. Fielding states that he was paid $20 to access the Walker Ridge property on the night in question and damage the kitchen supplies." He set it on the desk. "Mr. Fielding has also provided receipts." The room did not erupt. It did something quieter and more lasting than erupt. It went still. The particular stillness of people who have just heard something that rearranges the shape of everything they were looking at. Vernon Hale stood up. "That is a complete— Mr. Hale." Calloway's voice had changed. It was the same measured tone, but it had something underneath it now, something that had not been there an hour ago. "Sit down." Hale sat down. Calloway looked at the document for a long time. Then he looked at Colworth, who was no longer writing on his paper, and was instead sitting very still with the expression of an attorney who is rapidly calculating how far his professional liability extends. Then he looked at Hale, and whatever the nature of their friendship had been, something in that look suggested it was being revised in real time. "I'm going to take a brief recess," Calloway said. "I was gone for 11 minutes. Martha sat in the front row and did not move. Caleb was beside her close enough that she could feel the steadiness of him without any contact. Just his presence, solid and certain. The way a wall is solid, even when you're not touching it. Dutch was behind her. Lars was against the wall. 50-some people were in and around this room because she had cooked for them and they had come. She thought about Thomas. She thought about 3 years of Saturdays. She thought about the 5-cent piece on the edge of the table, and the man who had set it there, and the way the afternoon light had caught his hands when he unwrapped the first cinnamon roll. She thought, whatever happens in the next 11 minutes, this has already mattered. This room full of people has already mattered. That is not nothing. Calloway came back. He sat down. He put on his reading glasses. He looked at his papers. "The complaint against Martha Dawson is dismissed," he said. "The 1871 ordinance upon further review does not apply to the circumstances as established today." He set his papers down. "I am also referring the matter of the Roy Fielding statement to the county sheriff for formal investigation into criminal property damage, criminal intimidation, and potential witness interference." He looked directly at Hale. "Mr. Hale, I would strongly recommend retaining counsel for the criminal matter separate from your current representation." He took off his reading glasses. "We're adjourned." The room found its sound again. Not an explosion, more like a long breath released. Martha heard it around her, that collective exhale, and she sat still inside it for a moment before she moved. Clara grabbed her hand from 2 seats over. Nora, who was standing along the wall on the left side, pressed both hands briefly over her mouth, and then lowered them and straightened her back in the way of a woman who has decided that composure is appropriate. Pete made a noise that was technically a cheer, but came out sounding mostly like relief. Dutch said nothing. Dutch just nodded once slowly, the way he did when something was exactly what it should be. Caleb looked at her. Just looked at her for a moment, with the full quiet weight of everything that had been said and done in the past weeks between them. The kitchen conversations, the early mornings, the way she said his name without the Mr. now, and neither of them mentioned it, and he said, "You did that." "Moss did that." "Moss had the law," Caleb said. "You had 51 people who drove out of their way on a Thursday morning because of what you built." He held her gaze. "That was you, Martha." She didn't have an answer for that. She looked at the room, at the people still talking at Dutch, shaking Moss's hand at Ruth Beckett, standing near the door, with her hands still clasped, but a different quality of tension in them, now something loosened rather than held tight. She looked at all of it and let it be real. Outside on the steps, Vernon Hale walked past her with Colworth beside him, and his coat pulled straight and his hat level, maintaining the form of dignity, even as the substance of it was gone. He didn't look at her. She let him not look at her. She had nothing to say to him, and no energy to spend on saying it. Henderson caught her elbow at the bottom of the steps. "Mrs. Dawson," he said. "Sunday dinner's still on this week." She almost laughed. It came out smaller than that, a real sound. Involuntary, the kind that escapes when something catches you off guard. "Sunday dinner is still on," she said. "Good." He let go of her elbow. "I already told 2 men in Laramie about it. They're coming in from 60 miles. She watched him walk to his horse. She stood on the steps of the Red Creek County building on a Thursday morning in July, with the Wyoming sun on her face, and 51 people moving around her, talking and alive and present. And she understood that something had shifted today in a way that couldn't be unshifted. Not just the hearing, not just Hale. Something in the way the town saw her, yes, but more than that, something in the way she understood herself in relation to what she'd built and what it had turned out to mean. Caleb appeared at her shoulder. They stood side by side for a moment without speaking, watching the street. 12 miles back, he said eventually. 12 miles back, she agreed. They walked to the wagon together. Around them, Red Creek moved in its ordinary Thursday way carts and boots, and the smell of the bakery 2 doors down that had never once sent a customer her way. She didn't look at it bitterly. She looked at it the way you look at a place you are beginning to outgrow, not with resentment, just with the clear-eyed recognition that you have become larger than the frame it made for you. The ride back to Walker Ridge was quiet. A good quiet. The kind that exists between people who have been through something together and don't need to narrate it. The kind that means something is beginning that neither of them has found quite the right words for yet. She would find them. She had time. She had a kitchen and a table, and 51 people who would be back on Sunday. She had Clara and Nora and Dutch and Lars and Pete, with his sunburned nose, who had grown in 2 months from a suspicious boy into something resembling a fiercely loyal young man. She had a ranch that smelled like wood smoke and cut hay, and whatever was coming out of the oven, and for the first time in 3 years, she had the clear, solid, unshakable feeling that she was exactly where she belonged. The wagon wheels turned on the dirt road. 12 miles of good Wyoming summer stretched out in front of them. She let herself have it, all of it, without qualification, without waiting for the other shoe to drop. She had earned that much at least. She had earned considerably more than that, as it turned out. But that part would come on its own. It always did when the ground was solid enough to build on. The Sunday dinner after the hearing was the largest Walker Ridge had ever seen. 31 people. Every seat filled, and 3 borrowed chairs brought in from the bunkhouse. Henderson had made good on his word. He arrived with 2 men from Laramie, who sat down at the table with the cautious optimism of people who have been promised something extraordinary and aren't quite willing to believe it until the plate is in front of them. By the time Martha's pot roast hit the table, they had abandoned caution entirely. One of them, a rancher named Stills, who had the leathery reserve of a man who didn't hand out compliments, casually pushed back from his plate at the end of the meal and said to nobody in particular, "I have been eating at hotels and boarding houses across 3 territories for 20 years, and I want it on record that this woman just ended the argument." Nobody asked what argument. They all understood what argument. Martha heard it from the kitchen doorway and went back to her work table without comment. But Clara saw her face, and Clara smiled and said nothing, because that was the kind of moment you let a person have privately. The week after the hearing, the county sheriff's office arrested Roy Fielding on charges of criminal property damage. Fielding, it emerged quickly, had significantly more to say than what he'd put in his original statement. He had been paid not $20, but $35, and not just for the supply shed. Hale had also paid him 3 weeks earlier to spread specific rumors at the feed store and the saloon about the sanitary conditions of outdoor food operations in the county, generally using language Hale had written out for him on a piece of paper that Fielding had, with the particular survival instinct of a man who understands he may need leverage someday, kept. That paper came into the sheriff's possession on a Wednesday. By Thursday, it was in Garrett Moss's hands. By Friday, Vernon Hale had been formally notified that he was the subject of a criminal investigation for criminal conspiracy, property destruction, and witness intimidation. The Grand Plate closed the following Monday. Not because the law required it, yet the legal process would take months, but because the cook quit, then the waitstaff, then the 2 women who did the washing, one after the other, with the quiet decisiveness of people who have been waiting for permission to leave something they already knew was wrong. Hale stood in his empty restaurant on a Tuesday morning, and the town of Red Creek, which had protected and accommodated him for years, looked the other way, with the same practiced efficiency it had once directed at Martha. Martha heard about it from Dutch, who heard it from Pete, who heard it from his friend who worked at the livery stable 2 doors from the Grand Plate. She was rolling biscuit dough when Dutch told her. She rolled it out, cut the rounds, set them on the pan, and said, "I hope his cook found somewhere decent." Dutch looked at her. "That's all you've got to say about it?" "That's all I've got," she said. "I've got 30 people coming Sunday. I don't have time for Vernon Hale." Dutch laughed, a real laugh, not the contained kind he usually permitted himself, but something full and surprised. and Martha thought it was probably the best sound the kitchen had produced in all its weeks of excellent sounds. It was 2 weeks after the hearing on a still Tuesday evening that Caleb asked her to walk with him. I didn't make a production of it. He appeared at the kitchen door after supper and said, "Take a walk with me," in the same tone he used to discuss supply orders, and she untied her apron and went, because she had learned by now that Caleb Walker said simple things that meant layered things, and the only way to understand the layers was to show up for the simple thing first. I took her to the hill behind the north pasture. She had been there once before in daylight checking on a fence line with Dutch, and she knew the view from the top was the kind that Wyoming produces occasionally, as if to remind you of what it's capable of. The whole of the ranch laid out below the mountains to the west, going purple in the last light, the sky doing the enormous color things it did in summer when it had the whole dome of itself to work with. They stood at the top and looked at it for a while without speaking. Below them, the ranch was settling into evening lamps coming on in the bunkhouse. Dutch making his last round of the yard, the faint smell of wood smoke from the kitchen where Clara was finishing the wash-up. "I want to ask you something," Caleb said. "All right." I was quiet for a moment. Not the way a man is quiet when he's searching for words, but the way a man is quiet when he's decided on them and is giving them the proper weight before he sets them down. "I want to tell you something first." She waited. "When my wife died," he said, "I decided I was done with certain things. Not dramatically, just quietly done. The way you close a door you don't intend to open again." He looked at the mountains. "I ran the ranch. I did the work. It was enough. I told myself it was enough for a long time." She didn't say anything. The evening air moved between them warm and easy. "Then I was at a fair in Red Creek," he said, "and I saw a woman packing up her table like she was folding herself away, and I bought a cinnamon roll because I was hungry, and it was there." He paused. "And I stood there in the middle of all that noise, and I tasted something that somebody had made carefully that somebody had meant, and I thought—" He stopped, turned to look at her directly. "I thought whatever this woman is, I don't want to walk away from the table without understanding it better." Martha looked at him. The last light was on his face, and his dark eyes were steady on hers, with the particular directness of a man who has made a decision and is no longer uncertain about it. "It wasn't the roll," he said. "I need you to know that. I know I told you at the fair it was the roll. It wasn't. It was you. Something in the way you were standing there. Something that said this person has not quit, and she should have and she hasn't, and I want to know why." She was very still. "I know what I'm asking," he said. "I know it's not simple. I know you have built something here that is yours, and I would not for any reason ask you to diminish that, or set it aside, or make it smaller than it is." He reached into his vest pocket, and he opened his hand, and in his palm was a ring, plain gold, a narrow band with a small stone that caught the last of the light. "I am asking you to build it with me instead of beside me. I am asking you to let this ranch be home the way you've already made it feel like home but permanent. With my name if you'll have it, and my word which I keep." She looked at the ring. She looked at his face. She thought about the morning she'd driven 12 miles north on a dirt road with one bag and her mother's recipe book and no certainty about anything except that she had to try. She thought about the kitchen on the first day, the blackened skillet, the wrong weight sugar jar, the pantry that was a disaster, and the men who expected to be disappointed. She thought about Dutch saying her name with respect for the first time. She thought about Lars with his eyes closed. She thought about Clara crying on her first morning and Nora rolling up her sleeves like the range was an argument she intended to win. She thought about 3 years of empty Saturdays that had led by the exact, strange, and precise road of her own stubbornness to this hill. This evening, this man with his steady hands and his plain gold ring and his voice that said her name like it was something he had been careful with. "Yes," she said. He put the ring on her finger. Neither of them was dramatic about it. He just took her hand and put it on, and then kept holding her hand, and they stood on the hill and looked at the ranch in the evening light, and let the fact of it settle around them, like the kind of quiet that means everything is exactly as it should be. She said eventually, "You know this means the kitchen is permanently mine." It was permanently yours the Monday you walked in and told me the pantry was a disaster. I need a bigger range for the Sunday dinners. Done. And I want to hire 2 more women. There are women in Red Creek who need work and I know which ones. Done. And I want to put a proper sign at the road. Walker Ridge Dining. Not just the ranch name. Something that tells people what it is. He looked at her. That almost smileful now uncontained the real version of all the restrained ones she'd been cataloging for months. Done, he said. All of it. Done. She looked at the ring on her hand. She looked at the ranch below them. She let herself have it without qualification, without waiting, without the careful rationing of hope she'd taught herself over 3 years of Saturdays. She just let it be true. They were married 6 weeks later on a Sunday between the morning prep and the afternoon service, because Martha had 30 people coming for dinner, and she saw absolutely no reason why a wedding should interfere with a meal that people had traveled for. Dutch stood up for Caleb. Clara and Nora stood up for Martha. The circuit preacher who had sent that letter to Garrett Moss and meant every word of it performed the ceremony in the yard, with the mountains behind him, and the smell of something extraordinary coming from the kitchen, and every ranch hand in attendance in their best clothes, with their hats held against their chests. Pete cried. He denied it immediately and comprehensively, but he cried. Lars did not cry. Lars shook Caleb's hand with both of his, and said in the careful English of a man who speaks it as a second language, and means to be accurate, "Good man, good woman, good." And then he sat down to eat his Sunday dinner with the settled satisfaction of someone whose opinion of the world has been confirmed. Walker Ridge Dining Hall opened the following spring. 30 tables. A proper room added onto the back of the main house built by the ranch hands over the winter in the evenings after work, because nobody had asked them to, and they had done it anyway. Dutch designed the layout with the practical precision of a man who thinks in terms of function first and everything else second. Pete painted the sign at the road. He took 3 attempts to get it right, and the third one was genuinely good with clean letters and a small illustration of a biscuit that nobody had asked for, but that somehow made the sign exactly right. Martha hired 4 women from Red Creek before the hall opened. 2 were widows. One was a woman whose husband had left her with nothing, and whose skills had gone unrecognized for 20 years. One was 18 years old, and had been told repeatedly by people who should have known better that she wasn't suited for serious work. Martha put all 4 of them in her kitchen and trained them herself, and within 6 weeks they were producing food that travelers discussed for 50 miles. The hall filled every night by the second week. By the end of the first month, there was a waiting system for Sunday dinners that Martha organized by reservation and Caleb managed by correspondence because people had begun writing in advance to secure a seat. Letters came from Cheyenne, from Denver, from cattle operations in Montana who had heard about the pot roast. A woman's newspaper in Chicago ran a short piece about the Walker Ridge Dining Hall, based on a letter from Henderson, who had been mentioning it to everyone he met for months, and had finally found someone who wrote it down. The piece described in the precise language of people who take food seriously, a kitchen that understood nourishment, not as provision, but as dignity, as the act of saying to whoever sat at your table, "You are worth feeding well." Martha read it once. She folded it and put it in the kitchen drawer where she kept her mother's recipe book, and she went back to work. Vernon Hale's legal proceedings concluded 18 months after the hearing. He was convicted on 2 counts and paid a substantial fine and lost his business license permanently. The Grand Plate building was bought by a young couple from Kansas who turned it into a hardware store. Red Creek watched all of it happen and said very little in the way that towns say very little about things that reveal them unfavorably. The market on Saturdays continued. Martha went back sometimes not to sell. She had more business than she needed, but to check in with Ruth Beckett, who had become in the quiet aftermath of the hearing, something resembling a real friend. Ruth had a way of seeing things clearly once she had decided to look, and Martha had a way of saying difficult truths without cruelty. And between those 2 qualities, they had built something useful. Years passed the way. Good years pass quickly, and full of the specific texture of days lived properly. The kitchen at Walker Ridge became what Martha had always, somewhere in the unspoken architecture of herself, believed a kitchen could be a place where work meant something, where capability was honored, where women who had been told they were invisible discovered that they had been seen all along by the right people